Welcome to an exploration of Montessori's approach to developing creativity, intelligence, and imagination in the first plane of development. My name is Teresa, and I am a certified AMI primary guide. And I received my training from the Montessori Institute of San Diego, and I'm currently working on my master's in Montessori education from Loyola University. All reference materials to the topic I am presenting today will be available at the end of the video. Before we begin, I want to give some backstory to my original thoughts on imagination and how my Montessori experience and training has helped my perspective evolve throughout the years. First of all, let me state that I am a huge supporter of the arts. I loved being involved with theater, choir, and band growing up. I love children's literature, and I consider myself to be a sci-fi geek in my personal life. When I began in Montessori in 2013, I did not agree with a lot of Montessori's perspectives on fantasy and imagination. My original training was in early childhood education, and I believed a lot in play-based education. And I was fully invested in fairy tales and fantasy for the 0 to 6 age group. When I was told that Montessori did not support those types of experiences or storytelling for this age group, I was a little upset. It was a sore point for me. I loved so many different types of children's stories that were not real or based in reality. For instance, I loved the book Where the Wild Things Are by Marie Sendak. I kept asking myself, is it really reasonable to deprive children of such wonderful storytelling and art during the 0 to 6 years of development? It just didn't seem to make sense to me at the time. And I'm sure many of you today are coming to this topic asking yourself the same exact questions. My goal for today is not to condemn you for loving beautiful art and storytelling, nor is it to discourage you from sharing fantastical art with your child, but to take a deeper look at what is happening developmentally during the 0 to 6 age group and how we can support the development of creativity and imagination during this specific time period. This video will offer a discussion on Montessori's view of imagination and creativity. I will define reality and discuss the importance of the central nervous system as well as the process of adaptation in connection to reality. I will also define fantasy and discuss its role in our lives at different ages and stages. We will also cover deviations that can occur related to the fantasy state. After a deep dive into the world of fantasy, I will define imagination and discuss how imagination contributes to society in a way that fantasy does not. Finally, I will discuss how the Montessori environment develops imagination and creativity. Let's talk about Montessori's view of imagination and creativity. Paula Polk-Lillard said that creativity is inborn powers in the child that develop as his mental capacities are established through his interaction with the environment. Montessori believed in cultivating the qualities of creativity and imagination in the young child in a way that connects the child to reality. She believed that truth must be the foundation for creative energy because it constructs the mind and stimulates the imagination in a purposeful way. Dr. Montessori understood that adults tend to view children as naturally imaginative and fantastical. In response to that view, she emphasized that it is the adults who are imaginative, not the children. She wrote that children believe, they do not imagine. This is why it is important to introduce truth to the child, not fantasy. Montessori also emphasized that imagination can only have a sensory basis, meaning that imagination must be based in reality through interaction with the physical environment. Let's discuss what reality is. Dr. Deviations said, reality is what you perceive through your senses, what is recognized by the cerebral cortex. Because of this, reality must be the basis for creativity. Dr. Deviations goes on to explain that the only way we experience anything is through the nervous system, the brain. This means that the only way we can tell whether something is real is through the processes happening in our brain. So when we refer to imagination and creativity, we are referring to expressing what is in the mind, which can only be developed through concrete experiences and materials, through interaction with the physical environment. Dr. Deviations emphasizes that it is essential to stress the importance of reality as the basis of education. Let's discuss a little bit of the importance of the central nervous system in the development of creativity and imagination. In her book, The Absorbent Mind, Dr. Montessori discusses the system of relationship between the brain, senses, and muscles. I'm going to read a couple of excerpts beginning in chapter 13 of The Absorbent Mind. Let us review man's nervous system in all its amazing complexity. In the first place, we have the brain, or center. Then there are the various sense organs, which collect impressions and pass them on to the brain. Thirdly, there are the muscles and nerves. What do? They are like these cables for transmitting nervous energy to the muscles. And this energy is what controls the movements of the muscles. So the organization has three main parts: brain, senses, and muscles. Movement is the final result to which the working of all these delicate mechanisms leads up. She goes on to say, physiologists regard the muscles as a part of the central nervous system, saying this works as a whole to put man in relationship with his surroundings. In fact, this whole apparatus of brain, senses, and muscles is often called the system of relationship, meaning that it puts man in touch with his world, living and non-living, and therefore with other people. External impressions collect information through the sensory organs to inform the mind, which then stimulates creative thought. The more the senses are refined, the more accurate the impression becomes, which gives the mind greater clarity and discernment. This is an important aspect of developing intelligence. Dr. Dubovoy has emphasized that intelligence develops only through critical analysis of the reality that is perceived. This happens only in contact with reality, not in a world of make-believe stories. Let's talk about reality and adaptation. Before we do a deeper dive into the world of fantasy, I want to talk about adaptation, because that is a huge part of the child's work during the first 6 years of life. The American Montessori International defines adaptation as related to the idea of an absorbent mind is a special power of the young child that can be called the power of adaptation. This power is a process whereby the young child uses the environment to develop and, in so doing, becomes a part of that environment. The young child absorbs the culture of her time and place, taking in all the spirit, the customs, the ambitions, aspirations, and attitudes of society, simply by living in that society. So reality and adaptation are linked in a way that we need to explore further in order to understand fantasy's full impact on adaptation. In Montessori training, we call adaptation a human tendency. Instead of instincts like animals, Dr. Montessori believed humans had tendencies, and adaptation is one of those tendencies. The child begins his life with the work of adapting to his new environment. Dr. Montessori wrote, "The vital task of infancy is this work of adaptation, which takes the place of the hereditary behavior patterns present in the animal embryos. This helps the child orient himself to his new surroundings. Historically, humans were nomadic and constantly went through the process of changing locations and adapting to the new environment, exploring the new surroundings to provide for the basic needs of survival. For the child, this is done through adapting to home, family, and routines. As the child grows and develops, he explores his environment further and constantly reorients himself in the world based on his explorations that lead him further away from his home environment. Unlike an adult who acquires knowledge, the child absorbs it naturally, directly into his psyche. The adult must make an effort to learn, but the child learns from an unconscious absorption of his environment. The child absorbs everything, all the information provided to his senses without fatigue or effort, although genetics do play a part in dictating the process of absorption. Most importantly, the child cannot choose what he absorbs. He even absorbs feelings of patriotism, religion, social habits, culture, and values. The child in the 0 to 6 plane of development absorbs all experiences without discrimination between fantasy, virtual, and real. In Montessori, we call this the absorbent mind, which is a unique time period that exists only between the ages of 0 to 6. The absorbent mind gives the child the unique ability to construct himself in a way that allows him to adapt to his particular environment, including his culture and region. Interacting with the environment helps the child adapt and provides opportunities for him to understand his place in the universe. It is in the child's nature to have the desire to conquer his world, but first he must adapt to it. Dr. Dubovoy explains that, with regard to fantasy, when the cortex is still immature, the child cannot distinguish real from imaginary sensory input. With this in mind, if reality is constructed only through sensorial experiences, which helps the child adapt to his environment, what is the child absorbing from fantasy or virtual reality, and how will it help or hinder his ability to adapt to the real world when it is presented to him? What is fantasy? Dr. Montessori believed that the young child who often fantasizes must be called out of his fantasy world and back into reality in order to use his creative energies purposefully. She emphasized that there is a difference between the imagination that leads to creativity and the imagination that leads to fantasy. Creativity refers more to the concept of expressing what is in the mind through concrete experiences and materials. Fantasy is the concept of using the imagination to escape reality and offers no purposeful work for the child. It often reflects an unmet need within the child. Let's talk about pretend play. Children in the first plane of development find reality calming, even though they may imagine themselves being somewhere else or doing something else. Dr. Montessori believed that the pretend play an adult often sees in a young child is not a proof of imagination. It is a proof of an unsatisfied desire. The child lives in an adult-centric world, and his pretend play is actually proof not of his imagination, but of his dependent and powerless position in life. Instead of pretending to have that freedom and power, Dr. Montessori believed that the child should live in an environment that develops the skills that lead to freedom and power. Now, I do want to make an important note here. In Montessori, we do believe that fantasy can be introduced in the second plane of development, which begins around the age of 6. But for this discussion, we are referring specifically to the first plane of development, which is the 0 to 6 age group. Why do adults promote fantasy in childhood? There are many reasons why adults promote fantasy stories and experiences in childhood. The first reason is simply related to bonding with children. Dr. Dubovoy explains that for many adults, their most beloved memories from childhood are related to fairy tales told by parents or other adults. We can reassure parents that the same bonding that is produced when reading fairy tales can be created with stories based on reality that help the child to make sense of the world around him. The second reason why fantasy is often promoted has to do with marketing campaigns and big business opportunities from selling fantasy merchandise and experiences to children. Businesses like Disney generate a lot of revenue from fantasy and make-believe play. Adults are capable of discerning reality from fantasy and often enjoy the fantasy idea as big business markets to them, but we have to keep in mind that children before the age of 6 believe and do not imagine, not in the same way that adults do. The third reason we often promote fantasy is simply that fantasy can be used as a pacifier to distract children and to calm them. Adults often need a break, and fantasy can be very entertaining and mesmerizing for a young child, which can pacify them long enough to give the adult a much needed break in their day. The question that we have to ask is, what is that child absorbing when they watch that piece of entertainment? The fourth reason we use fantasy in childhood is often for didactic storytelling. Adults like using stories and fairy tales such as Little Red Riding Hood to teach a right from wrong or even a good versus evil concept. It has long been a part of our culture to teach morality through fantastical stories. Let's talk about deviations. When children begin to spend their time in a constant state of imagination, deviations occur. Dr. Montessori viewed deviations as obstacles to prevent children from developing in a normal and healthy way. She classified two types of deviations, physical and mental, or psychic deviations. Dr. Dubovoy explains that it is now becoming impossible to distinguish between reality and representations of reality or computer-generated realities. As images come to our senses faster and are more sensational, we become less and less able to distinguish between what is real and what is synthetic, simulated, and replicated. She then goes on to say, it was noticed that young children who watch TV for long periods start to have problems of adaptation, learning difficulties, and behavior deviations. The child suffers a multisensory deprivation and a lack of motor development, which impair the ability to concentrate. The good news is that a child's deviation can be corrected between the ages of 3 and 6, but the consequences of not correcting it escalate as the child grows older. After the first plane of development, it becomes much more difficult to correct deviations. Let's get into the dangers of fantasy. The first danger of allowing the child to enter a fantasy world is that a child's needs cannot be satisfied in a pretend world. Somewhere in the child's fantasy is a need that has not been fulfilled. It is our obligation to figure out what need the child is expressing and offer him a path to fulfill that need in the real world. The second danger is that there are no limitations and no control of error in a fantasy world. Dr. Montessori wrote, "In the world of fantasy, wherein it thrives, there is no control of error, nothing to coordinate thought. If limitations are not provided, the child will struggle to develop the inner discipline he needs to gain independence and experience true freedom. The child cannot develop the skills he needs to become independent or confident in a fantasy world. As a result, his development becomes stunted." The third danger is that a disconnection from reality is also a disconnection from creativity. Dr. Montessori believed that people should use their imagination to make a contribution to society, which can only happen if a person is connected to reality. Imagination without purpose, without truth, becomes fantasy that offers very little, if anything, to society. It becomes an inward journey that contributes only to the person's internal world without thought of contributing to society. If a child becomes disconnected from reality, his creativity will also become disconnected from reality. The fourth danger is that fantasy can limit experiences to the external world or confuse sensorial experiences within the child. Children absorb everything in the first plane, but if they are only allowed limited exposure to the real world, and if the sensorial impressions the child experiences are from the fantasy or virtual reality, they will limit their movements to what is fantastical or virtual and only absorb what is not true. Let's talk about imagination. Dr. Montessori determined that imagination is constructed from external impressions that inform the mind of the concrete world. External impressions collect information through the sensory organs to inform the mind, which then stimulates creative thought. As Dr. Dubovoy explained, imagination has a sensory basis, and its construction in the mind has to be firmly established by reality. The more it is connected with reality of the external world, the higher will be the value of its internal creations. The more the senses are refined, the more accurate the impressions become, which gives the mind greater clarity and discernment. Dr. Dubovoy goes on to explain, when we think about the inventions of Leonardo da Vinci, which were made into reality many years later, we can recognize that they were invented through the observation and knowledge of real things, real objects, and real elements in nature. Now let's talk about how imagination contributes to society. Dr. Montessori believed that people should use their imagination to make a contribution to society. She wrote, "When imagination starts from contact with reality, thought begins to construct works by means of which the external world becomes transformed, almost as if the thought of man had assumed a marvelous power, the power to create." She believed that an imagination that leads to an avoidance of reality, or what we call fantasy, causes mental fatigue and wastes the potentiality of life. There is a natural, instinctive desire in humans to create and transform the world, but this can only happen if imagination and reality work in cooperation with each other. Dr. Montessori wanted children to develop their imagination to the fullest potential so that they can make beautiful and purposeful contributions to society. She believed that the greatest inventions and works of creativity were inspired by intense and unique observations of reality. Let's discuss the Montessori environment. In the Montessori environment, we know that the child constructs his character and personality through these real-world experiences. The refinement of his senses brings him greater clarity of thought. Because of this, he is able to observe the world more accurately and adapt to it more proficiently. The Montessori environment is dedicated to this goal in a variety of ways. The first is the refinement of the senses through the sensorial area of the room. This area provides the opportunity to isolate each of the child's senses and allows him to explore that sense to his greatest potential. In addition to sensorial impressions, the child is also encouraged to explore his environment through movement, both inside and outside the classroom. These experiences connect with the child's inner teacher, which is the voice inside the child guiding him to perfect himself through his interactions with his environment. The precision in the materials encourages the child to explore an exact impression of the external world and calls the child to repeat that work until he has perfected a particular skill. The work in the Montessori classroom is based on real objects and real experiences. For example, instead of pretending to bake or sweep the floor, we offer children, even as young as 18 months, the opportunity to work with food and sweep a mess that develops as a result of that work. Dr. Montessori discovered that children lost interest in pretend play very quickly, but when she introduced real work to the children, their concentration deepened and their physical skills developed to a much greater extent. As a result of Dr. Montessori's observations, she discovered that reality is actually far more calming for children than was previously understood. It is our goal in the Montessori environment to help the child develop creativity by allowing him to connect more deeply with all that is real.